May 21, 1940. The fields south of Arras, France. German anti-tank crews watched British armour approaching across open ground and felt confident. Their 37mm Pak 36 guns had shattered Polish tanks. They had punched through French light armour. Every engagement so far had ended the same way: enemy tanks burning, German positions holding. The gunners loaded armour-piercing rounds and waited for the range to close. Then they opened fire, and nothing happened. Round after round struck the approaching tanks. Sparks flew, steel rang against steel, but the British machines kept coming, their tracks churning through the spring mud, main guns traversing toward German positions. Panic spread through the anti-tank crews. The standard German anti-tank gun, the weapon that had proven itself across Poland and into France, was bouncing harmlessly off these slow-moving monsters. Crews abandoned their positions, infantry scattered. The 37mm rounds that should have been lethal at these ranges were doing nothing more than scratching paint. German commanders scrambled for solutions. They called for artillery support, but the British tanks were already among their positions. They tried concentrating fire from multiple guns on single targets, hoping accumulated hits might find a weakness. The rounds kept deflecting. Some crews attempted flank shots, reasoning that side armour must be thinner. It wasn't thin enough. The only weapons that seemed effective were the 88mm anti-aircraft guns hastily pressed into ground combat roles. But these were scarce, immobile, and never intended for this purpose. For the first time in the war, German forces faced armour they simply could not stop with their standard equipment. The psychological impact rippled through command channels. What were these British tanks, and why couldn't German guns kill them? If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing. I'm Harry, and on this channel, WW2 with Harry, we uncover the forgotten weapons and battlefield problems of World War II. Hit that like button if you want more stories like this. Now let's get back to how this crisis began. The spring of 1940 had affirmed the Wehrmacht's faith in blitzkrieg. Its combined arms principles of speed and coordination had overwhelmed static defences in Poland and France. Opposition was encountered, but nothing standard German anti-tank weapons couldn't handle. Well, the 37mm PA 36 was the backbone of this defence, light, mobile and effective against the thin-skinned French Renault tanks and Polish 7TPs. German crews trusted it, and doctrine was built around it. Then the British tanks arrived at Arras and everything changed. The problem wasn't immediately obvious. British armour in France was mostly scattered, poorly coordinated, or abandoned due to mechanical failure. German forces had grown accustomed to British light tanks like the Vickers Mark VI, whose thin armour the 37mm punched through with ease. But the tanks approaching south of Arras on May 21st were different. They moved at a ponderous walking pace, their tracks grinding through soft earth. German gunners felt no concern. Slow targets were easy targets, and Pak 36 crews had drilled for this scenario. Confident in their training, they loaded armour-piercing rounds and fired where penetration should have been guaranteed. The first impacts produced sparks and the ring of steel, but the tanks kept coming. Gunners adjusted their aim to track assemblies, turret rings and hull joints, hoping to find a weak point. More rounds struck and more sparks flew, yet the British tanks didn't slow. Their 2-pounder guns began returning fire, inflicting German casualties. Infantry dove for cover as anti-tank crews reloaded frantically, firing as fast as the manual breech allowed. Round after round struck home and everyone deflected. At 400 metres, armour-piercing rounds that should have penetrated 50mm of steel were bouncing off like pebbles. Panic is contagious. When one crew abandons their gun, others follow. The shock of watching your weapon fail repeatedly against an advancing enemy breaks cohesion faster than enemy fire. South of Arras, German anti-tank positions collapsed because crews could not believe their trusted guns were useless. The Pak 36 had been the answer to armour across Europe. Now it only announced their positions to British gunners who could kill them with impunity. German officers tried concentrating fire, hoping accumulated damage from multiple guns might find a weak point. Surviving Park 36 were repositioned for crossfire, hoping flank shots would be more effective. The British tanks, however, had 78mm of frontal armour and 70mm on the sides, as intelligence later confirmed. The Pak 36's armour-piercing round could penetrate only 48mm at 400 metres under ideal conditions. The mathematics were unforgiving. No angle of attack or concentration of fire could overcome the armour. The guns lacked the kinetic energy. Crews attempted desperate field modifications. Some tried loading 2 rounds simultaneously, hoping the combined impact would crack the armour. But the Pa-36's breech jammed or exploded. Others attempted point-blank shots, dragging their guns to within 100 metres. Penetration improved marginally, but the British 2-pounders could easily destroy the unarmoured Pa-36's, turning the tactic into a suicide mission. Some units resorted to Molotov cocktails and satchel charges, but these infantry tactics required getting within metres of the lethal tanks, where men were cut down by machine guns or crushed under tracks. The 88mm flak gun was the only reliable solution, and its deployment revealed the desperation. These were anti-aircraft weapons designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers. Weighing over 5 tons, requiring a crew of 11 and a 30-minute setup, they were never intended for direct-fire ground combat. Yet their high-velocity 88mm rounds could penetrate the British armour at over 1,000 metres. Commanders pulled flak batteries from air defence duties to guard advance routes. It worked, but at tremendous cost. Each reassigned 88mm left German columns vulnerable to RAF attack, and the guns were too heavy to reposition quickly. If bypassed or flanked, the 8080s became expensive, immobile targets. Tactical implications cascaded through German command. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division repeatedly called for 88mm support against these tanks, with his reports noting standard anti-tank weapons were ineffective against the heavily armoured British vehicles. The 5th Panzer Division also lost multiple Pak-36 guns after their rounds failed to penetrate. Infantry units reported that the British tanks drove directly through their positions, immune to small arms and anti-tank guns, crushing machine gun nests and scattering defenders. The psychological impact was severe, as infantry, who had been trained to trust their anti-tank guns, now found them useless against this new threat. Intelligence officers scrambled to understand the new threat. Captured documents and interrogated prisoners revealed the tanks were infantry support vehicles, specifically designed to be immune to standard anti-tank weapons. Their armour exceeded anything encountered in Poland or France. The slow speed, barely 15 miles per hour on roads, was intentional to keep pace with advancing infantry. They were not breakthrough weapons, but mobile pillboxes designed to suppress enemy positions. Against the Pak-36, they were nearly invincible. Captured British tanks were shipped to Germany for evaluation. Engineers measured armour thickness and tested its quality, confirming what frontline troops knew: these tanks followed a different design philosophy. While German tanks prioritised mobility and firepower, these British vehicles prioritised protection. Their case-hardened steel armour, sometimes sloped, was thick enough to defeat standard German anti-tank rounds. Their guns were adequate, their engines reliable, and tracks durable. They were slow, but speed was irrelevant when enemy guns couldn't inflict damage. The German response involved several parallel efforts. The 50mm Pak-38 was rushed into production, though it would not reach the front in significant numbers until 1941. The diversion of 88mm flak guns to anti-tank roles increased, despite the resulting vulnerability to air attack. Tank designers began work on vehicles with thicker armor and more powerful guns, while infantry received new training in close assault tactics using satchel charges and magnetic mines. None of these solutions were ideal, and all required time. The fundamental problem remained unsolved through the summer of 1940. German forces possessed an anti-tank gun, the Pak-36, that could not defeat this new armor, and a stopgap solution, the 88mm flak gun, that was too scarce and immobile to be a real answer. With future weapons months away from deployment, every engagement with these British tanks carried the risk of tactical failure. German infantry feared the slow-moving British monsters, anti-tank crews requested reassignment, and officers filed reports demanding heavier guns, anything that could reliably stop the armoured nightmares. What the Wehrmacht needed was a weapon that satisfied multiple contradictory requirements simultaneously. It had to be powerful enough to penetrate 78mm of case-hardened armour at combat ranges, at least 500 meters, preferably more. It had to be mobile enough to keep pace with advancing infantry and mechanized columns, which meant it couldn't weigh 5 tons like the 88mm. It had to be reliable enough for frontline service in all weather conditions, simple enough for conscript crews to operate under fire, and cheap enough to manufacture in the thousands. It needed to be available immediately, not in 6 months or a year, and it had to work the first time, every time, because crews who faced these British tanks with inadequate weapons didn't get second chances. No weapon in the German arsenal satisfied all those requirements. The Pak-36 was mobile and reliable, but lacked penetration. The 88mm had penetration, but was immobile and scarce. Heavier guns in development would take too long to field. Improvised solutions, satchel charges, magnetic mines required suicidal courage and rarely worked. The British had created an armoured vehicle that exposed a fundamental gap in German capabilities. Until that gap was filled, every encounter with these slow, heavily armoured tanks carried the potential for disaster. The fields south of Arras had proven that German anti-tank doctrine was built on a flawed assumption. Now German forces needed a solution that didn't yet exist, a weapon that could be everywhere, immediately, and powerful enough to kill what the Pak-36 could not. The engineering challenge seemed impossible. The tactical need was desperate, and the British tanks kept coming. The first Matildas arrived at British armoured units in France, looking like relics from an earlier war. Crews accustomed to the graceful lines of cruiser tanks stared at machines that seemed built from scrap metal and determination. The hulls were assembled from cast armor sections, bolted and riveted together, creating harsh angular surfaces. The turrets sat low and squat, barely rising above the hull line. When crews climbed aboard, they felt the weight immediately. The suspension groaned under 27 tons, and the twin AEC diesel engines laboured audibly just to move the machines forward. The tracks were narrow for such mass, and the whole assembly looked like it might shake itself apart at speed. Officers demonstrated the basics, traversing the turret, loading the main gun, and operating the radio set crammed into the already tight fighting compartment. Crews noted the thickness of the armour plating around the driver's position was far heavier than anything they'd encountered. When asked about maximum speed, the answer drew sceptical laughter. 15 miles per hour cross-country, perhaps 24 on ideal roads. Tank commanders trained on faster machines wondered how they were supposed to exploit breakthroughs or conduct reconnaissance at walking pace. The vision blocks were small, the interior cramped and hot even in May weather. Loading the main gun required precise choreography in a space barely large enough for 2 men. Yet the solid thunk of hatches closing and the way small arms fire pinged harmlessly off the hull during training exercises suggested these ungainly machines might survive what killed other tanks. The official designation was Infantry Tank Mark II, though crews shortened it to Matilda II to distinguish it from the earlier, lighter Matilda I. The design specifications revealed the philosophy behind it: 78mm of frontal armour on the turret and hull, with side armour from 65mm to 70mm. This was protection unprecedented in 1940. The German Panzer III carried 30mm frontal armour. French tanks rarely exceeded 40mm. The Matilda's designers at Vulcan Foundry had created a mobile fortress, deliberately sacrificing speed and firepower for survivability. Its main armament was the 2-pounder gun, a 40mm weapon effective against contemporary tanks but with limited high-explosive capability. Secondary armament was a single 7.92mm Baser machine gun. The twin AEC diesel engines produced a combined 174 horsepower, barely adequate for the vehicle's mass. Maximum road speed was officially 24 kilometers per hour, though rarely achieved in practice. Its complex suspension of bogies and coil springs provided reasonable cross-country performance. British doctrine demanded infantry tanks that could advance with foot soldiers, absorbing anti-tank fire that would destroy faster machines. The Matilda II embodied this doctrine. It was designed to be nearly invulnerable to the standard German 37mm Pak 36, which could penetrate approximately 36mm of armour at 500 metres. Against 78mm of protection, the Pa 36 was useless at any combat range. The Matilda II proved its value on May 21, 1940, during the British counterattack at Arras. The 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments advanced with approximately 74 tanks against German positions south of the town. The 7th RTR's Matildas encountered elements of Rommel's 7th Panzer Division and SS Totenkopf Division near Wylie. German anti-tank crews opened fire, expecting the familiar sight of penetration and burning tanks. Instead, 37mm rounds sparked off the Matilda's armour and ricocheted. Crews inside heard the impacts as metallic clangs that failed to penetrate. The British tanks continued advancing, their 2-pounder guns methodically engaging German positions. Wartime accounts describe German infantry breaking as the Matildas rolled through their positions, apparently invulnerable. The psychological effect was profound. German soldiers, trained that the Pa 36 could defeat any Allied tank, watched their training invalidated. Crews abandoned their guns or fired uselessly until British tanks destroyed them at close range. But the engagement also revealed the Matilda's critical limitations. The counterattack advanced 10 miles before stalling, the tanks having outpaced their infantry support. German forces recovered and brought forward 88mm anti-aircraft guns in ground rolls, weapons that could penetrate the Matilda's armour. Luftwaffe Stuka dive bombers appeared overhead. The Matildas had no effective anti-aircraft capability, and their slow speed made them vulnerable to air attack. Several were destroyed or immobilized by bomb damage. The counterattack ultimately failed, but it demonstrated that an entire generation of German anti-tank weapons was obsolete against properly armoured targets. The Matilda II's combat record expanded in North Africa in late 1940. During Operation Compass, the British offensive against Italian forces in Egypt and Libya, Matildas of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment spearheaded attacks against fortified positions. At the Battle of Bardia in January 1941, 16 Matildas supported Australian infantry assaulting Italian defences. Italian 47mm anti-tank guns proved nearly as ineffective as German 37mm weapons. The Matildas broke through the perimeter with minimal losses, while allowing infantry to exploit the breach. Similar performances occurred at Tobruk and Baie de Somme. Against Italian armour and anti-tank weapons, the Matilda was effectively invulnerable. Crews developed confidence bordering on arrogance, advancing into positions that would have been suicidal in lighter tanks. The 2-pounder gun, though limited against fortifications, proved adequate against Italian M13/40 tanks. The Matilda's reputation as a nearly indestructible infantry support weapon was cemented by these North African victories. The arrival of German forces in North Africa in early 1941 eroded the Matilda's advantage. The Africa Corps brought 50mm PaK-38 anti-tank guns capable of penetrating the Matilda's armour at closer ranges and began employing 88mm anti-aircraft guns in anti-tank roles. The 88mm could penetrate the Matilda's frontal armour at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. During Operation Battleaxe in June 1941, British Matildas encountered German defensive positions incorporating these heavier weapons, and tank losses increased significantly. The Matilda's slow speed became a critical liability, as crews could not maneuver quickly to avoid fire or exploit tactical opportunities. Its small turret and 2-pounder gun meant the Matilda could not effectively engage German positions at the ranges where 88mm guns operated. By mid-1942, the Matilda was increasingly relegated to infantry support roles, where its armour remained valuable, but its limitations were less critical. Production of the Matilda II began in 1937, with deliveries in 1939. Manufacturing involved multiple contractors, including Vulcan Foundry, John Fowler and Company, Ruston and Hornsby, and the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. The complex cast armour construction and precision required for the turret ring limited production rates. Approximately 2,987 Matilda IIs were manufactured before production ended in August 1943. Peak monthly production reached about 100 units during 1941. The tank remained in British frontline service in North Africa until late 1942, when American-supplied M3 Grant and M4 Sherman tanks began replacing it. Matildas continued serving in secondary theatres like the Pacific, where Australian forces employed them against Japanese positions in New Guinea and Borneo through 1945. The thick armour remained effective against Japanese anti-tank weapons, which were generally lighter than their German equivalents. The Soviet Union received 918 Matildas under Lend-Lease, using them primarily for infantry support on the Eastern Front through 1943. The Matilda II never achieved the fame of later British tanks like the Churchill or American Shermans. Its slow speed and limited firepower made it unsuitable for the mobile warfare that dominated later war years. Museums today display surviving examples as curiosities, tanks that looked obsolete when new but proved devastatingly effective in their intended role. Military historians recognize the Matilda II as validation of the infantry tank concept, a vehicle designed for a specific tactical purpose rather than general-purpose combat. For approximately 18 months between 1940 and mid-1942, it was the most heavily armoured tank in combat service anywhere in the world. That armour advantage forced Germany to completely redesign its anti-tank doctrine and accelerate development of heavier weapons. The Matilda II solved the immediate problem of 1940, how to advance infantry through defensive positions dominated by anti-tank guns, even though its design was already becoming obsolete as it entered service. It was the right weapon for a specific moment in military history, and in that moment it was nearly invincible.